faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today we're interpreting the book Like Us Crazy, subtitled The Globalization of American Mental Illnesses. Talking about globalization, you're all familiar with it. McDonald's golden arches everywhere. Nike and LV ads are symbols of it. But do you know what the globalization of mental illnesses is all about? Feel free to leave a comment and discuss with us. The author of this book, Ethan Waters, is an American journalist and writer, long dedicated to nonfiction on psychiatry and social psychology, with books like Urban Tribes and Making Monsters. Waters observed that in recent years, disease classifications and treatments developed by Americans have spread worldwide. For example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders by the American Psychiatric Association has become a global standard. Waters argues that while psychological suffering is universal, symptoms and understanding of illness are largely shaped by culture. Yet the export of Western mental illness concepts, though well-intentioned, erases cultural differences, spreading disorders globally and making this crazy world more alike. Like Us Crazy, published in 2010, Waters uses cases like anorexia and PTSD to outline the impact of Western ideas on other regions and their negative effects. Now, I'll break down the book's main content into two parts for you. In part one, we'll discuss how the spread of Western mental illness concepts increased anorexia prevalence in Hong Kong. In part two, we'll explore issues where Western psychotherapy might not adapt well to other regions. Okay, for part one, let's start with anorexia nervosa in the 1990s. The rise of anorexia nervosa in Hong Kong, it's a mental eating disorder where patients diet excessively or refuse food due to fear of weight gain or low mood. According to the DSM, short for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, key criteria for anorexia include fear of obesity and distorted body image perception, which means they're already extremely thin but still think they're overweight. Westerners generally believe that cultural factors trigger anorexia, specifically pop culture's obsession with skinny models and Barbie-like figures, causing people, especially young women, to develop the disorder. Now, if this theory holds, 1980s Hong Kong should have been a breeding ground for anorexia. It embraced Western values and lifestyles, idolizing celebrities, slender figures, just like Western culture does. Additionally, Hong Kong parents and teachers created intense academic pressure, often leading teens to express inner turmoil through food refusal. One saying, incel, is yet back then, Hong Kongers knew almost nothing about anorexia, with very few local cases. Li Cheng is a Hong Kong-based anorexia specialist. In the 1980s, after completing psychiatric studies in Britain, he returned home to research local anorexia cases. Reviewing his hospital's patient database, Li Cheng found only about 10 cases total between 1983 and 1988, 5 years. Not a single paper on anorexia in Chinese women appeared in China's two major psychiatric journals then. Li Cheng speculated this partly stemmed from traditional Chinese beliefs that eating well brings happiness. Also, Chinese girls experience puberty later than Westerners, allowing more time to develop emotional maturity for handling adolescent pressures. The few Hong Kong anorexia patients showed symptoms vastly different from Western cases. They didn't fear obesity and clearly recognized their thinness. Zhao, a 31-year-old sales assistant, was among Li Cheng's first anorexia patients. In 1988, when Li Cheng first met Zhao, her extreme emaciation shocked him. For example, Zhao, 160 centimeters tall, but weighing just 21.5 kilograms, resembled a walking skeleton. She was unresponsive socially, with subnormal temperature, low blood pressure, and a faint 60 beats per minute heartbeat. Zhao came from an ordinary Hong Kong working-class family. Her father worked away for years to support them, demanding absolute obedience when home. often scolding her and her mom over trivial matters. Although the family wasn't particularly harmonious, there was no abuse or domestic violence, nor any family medical history. What directly triggered Aja's anorexia was a breakup. In 1984, Aja went to see Dr. Li Cheng for treatment. 4 years earlier, her boyfriend suddenly abandoned her and emigrated to the UK. Desperate, Ajao stopped eating, telling her family it was due to physical discomfort and stomach pain. Meanwhile, her desire for social interaction decreased, and she even lost her job. When Li Cheng asked Ajao to describe her symptoms, she didn't do so like a typical Western anorexia patient. She didn't say she feared gaining weight, nor did she care if she was eating too much. Instead, she said her problem was being too thin and having low mood, but she didn't feel hungry at all and often felt bloated. These atypical anorexia symptoms, differing from modern Western diagnostic standards, weren't unique to Ajao. Most of the anorexia patients Li Cheng treated in Hong Kong during that period denied fearing weight gain or refusing food to become more beautiful. They often claimed to have physical issues like bloating or something stuck in their throat, which is why they stopped eating. And interestingly, the symptoms of these Hong Kong female patients were similar to those of early Western anorexia patients over a century ago. For example, in 1823, a 16-year-old girl in Frankfurt, after her parents forbade her relationship, began feeling a heavy pressure in her esophagus that prevented her from eating. Clearly, psychological issues caused the girl's anorexic behavior, but what the girl experienced were physical symptoms. She genuinely felt something was stuck in her throat. Many patients at that time, like this girl, reported physical symptoms such as feeling a lump in their throat or being unable to chew. It's important to note that during this period, formal diagnostic criteria for anorexia hadn't been established. In the latter half of the 19th century, refusal to eat due to abdominal pain, vomiting, or throat obstruction was considered a symptom of hysteria. Simply put, hysteria is a mental disorder. It was widely discussed in the 19th century, and it wasn't until 1873 that anorexia nervosa was officially recognized as a disease. Doctors believed that typical anorexia patients were females aged 15 to 20 who started refusing food due to emotional issues and prolonged this behavior indefinitely. 1020. And as anorexia got its official name, its incidence rate began to skyrocket. By the late 19th century, anorexia exploded across the West, with medical literature filled with records of it. A medical PhD candidate wrote in his thesis that, among all hysteria cases, none was more common than anorexia. What caused the surge in anorexia cases in the late 19th century? Canadian medical historian Edward Shorter believes there's a link between the establishment of anorexia nervosa and the rise in cases. At any point in history, humans have only a limited set of symptoms to express psychological suffering. Shorter calls this pool of available symptoms the symptom pool, where culturally recognized symptoms reside. People select symptoms from this pool to express unspoken emotions or inner conflicts. In other words, influenced by cultural cues, people unconsciously create symptoms that align with prevailing medical diagnoses. When anorexia became an official disease, it gained cultural acceptance and entered the symptom pool. Thus, more people expressed suffering through it. Interestingly, the symptom pool isn't static. By mid-20th century, anorexia nervosa faded from public view. A doctor named Brooke found few anorexia cases then, and patients didn't understand their condition. Each patient had unique symptoms until 1983, when singer Karen Carpenter's death brought anorexia back into public consciousness. Carpenter's hits include Yesterday Once More and Top of the World. She died of heart failure caused by anorexia. In the following decade, anorexia resurged in the West. Reflecting on anorexia's evolution, doctors concluded, Unlike polio or mumps, mental illness can't exist isolated from socio-historical context. So how did anorexia invade Hong Kong? It connects to the death of a secondary school student named Lin Xiao. On November 24th, 1994, 14-year-old Lin Xiao collapsed on her way home and never woke up. The week before, she'd fainted twice from hunger. Lin Xiao was a model child, excellent grades, sociable, and active in extracurriculars. In August 1994, Lin Xiao's weight began to plummet, and she became withdrawn, no longer playing with friends. Her mother couldn't understand why her daughter was eating less and less. The author believes Lin Xiao's changes were tied to the social climate of that era. In the 1990s, many Hong Kong residents emigrated abroad, disrupting local social networks. And for teenagers already in a confused phase, this rupture of social bonds hit especially hard. Particularly, one of Lin Xiao's peers wrote that sudden school transfers and rushed goodbyes caused panic. Though never diagnosed with anorexia, Lin Xiao's condition alarmed her school, teachers, and social workers. They urged her to eat more and see a doctor, but she collapsed before reaching the hospital. But the autopsy showed Lin Xiao had almost no body fat, with severe atrophy in kidneys and stomach. Her heart made only 85 grams, less than a healthy toddler's 60 grams heart. Since she collapsed in a busy commercial district, her death instantly became headline news. Dr. Li Cheng viewed Lin Xiao's death as a pivotal moment for anorexia awareness in Hong Kong. Before this, most Hong Kongers knew little about the disorder. But starting in 1994, media flooded with anorexia reports, largely framing it through Western lenses. Experts in media linked it to pressures on young women, dieting, and beauty standards. They repeatedly told the public that anorexia targets those prone to anxiety or depression, young women who may face difficulties at home or school. Anorexia's core is fear of obesity, driven by cultural emphasis on thinness and beauty. To prevent another tragedy, Hong Kong schools launched anorexia education programs and a 24-hour teen counseling hotline. But the author argues this ironically taught teens that anorexia wasn't just Western. They themselves were high risk. What happened next, you've probably guessed.
Within years of Lin Xiao's death, several Hong Kong actresses and singers came forward with anorexia diagnoses.
Dr. Li Cheng used to see only 2 or 3 anorexia patients a year, but now he gets new cases weekly. More cases generate more media coverage. Studies found that by the late 1990s, 3 to 10% of Hong Kong women showed disordered eating behaviors. Hong Kong's anorexia cases surged, with symptoms increasingly mirroring Western counterparts. Dr. Li Cheng's early patients didn't care much about their physical appearance, but by 1997, 80% of anorexia patients cited fear of weight gain as their main reason. By 2007, nearly all patients reported obesity fears. Society's changing understanding affects how patients experience and express the illness. This doesn't mean Western influence solely caused Hong Kongers' anorexia. As mentioned earlier, these patients faced era-specific pressures and emotional issues. Anorexia just provided an outlet. Every anorexia report and concept repetition reinforces unconscious beliefs, making dieting an easier signal for inner suffering. This phenomenon isn't unique to East-West cultural transmission. The author argues the 1990s UK bulimia outbreak connects to Princess Diana's history with the illness. Bulimia also affects women predominantly, binge eating when stressed or alone, then purging from guilt. In 1992, UK bulimia rates surged right after rumors spread about Princess Diana having it. In 1995, Fei Long publicly confirmed she'd had bulimia for over 4 years. She told the public, "She torments herself because your self-esteem is too low. You don't believe you're worthy." UK bulimia rates peaked that year. Incidentally, Hong Kong was affected too. Vomiting and laxative use became trendy among teens. Many Hong Kong patients told doctors they adopted these behaviors after reading or hearing about others doing it. In 1997, Diana and Fei Long passed away, and the UK's bulimia rates started declining. Experts speculate there were always many bulimia cases, but Fei Long's personal struggle heightened awareness, making professionals more likely to recognize symptoms and patients more willing to admit issues, thus increasing reported rates. After Fei Wong's death, fewer people might have admitted having bulimia. The author considers these hypotheses reasonable, but we shouldn't overlook another possibility. Fei Long's public self-analysis and pleas for help encouraged unconscious imitation. Essentially, bulimia entered the symptom pool, driving up incidence. So, when Fei Long died, such imitation gradually decreased, and so did the rates. Okay, moving on. We've covered how anorexia became prevalent in 1990s Hong Kong. How did symptoms converge with the West? If that was accidental, Japan's shift in depression perception around 2000 was orchestrated. The author notes Japan's depression understanding fundamentally differed from the West's for centuries. This nation glorifies sadness, viewing deep sorrow as natural. Japanese, even enlightened. Japanese lacks a word matching English depression in meaning. Though a psychiatric term exists, ubio, melancholia, it describes debilitating, rare cases preventing normal work or life. Everyday discomforts, like divorce, were seen as unrelated to mental health or suicide. But through clever marketing, pharma firms reframed depression as a common cold of the mind, treatable with pills like cough syrup, less severe than ubio. Meanwhile, Japan faced economic recession, rising social pressures, and alarming suicide rates. After the 1995 Great Hanshin earthquake, Western and Japanese mental health experts convinced the public of American superiority in depression and anxiety research, turning Japan into a key antidepressant market. In 2008, an antidepressant called Seroxat surpassed $100 million in annual sales in Japan. Since 2001, Japanese psychiatrists reported a surge of patients bringing magazine articles or flyers to hospitals, demanding discussions about their conditions. So, their depressive symptoms were so mild, they wouldn't have been considered illnesses before. And a Japanese doctor named Ono told the author that the depression is a mental cold slogan, convinced countless people to seek treatment for non-illnesses. That concludes part 1. We've covered how Western mental illness concepts spread to other regions, influencing local understanding. This may trigger outbreaks of certain mental illnesses elsewhere, with symptoms converging with Western patterns. Beyond this, Western therapeutic approaches may also face cultural incompatibility in other regions. Next, in part 2, we'll examine post-tsunami Sri Lanka to see problems caused by rigidly applying Western therapeutic concepts. On December 26, 2004, a magnitude 9.3 earthquake struck north of Sumatra, Indonesia. The quake triggered history's deadliest tsunami disaster. 226,000 people died across Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and other nations. In subsequent months, these countries saw massive international mental health interventions, with trauma therapists from the US, UK, France, etc., flooding in to export PTSD to Eastern nations. Simply put, PTSD refers to mental disorders following traumatic events like witnessing deaths, facing mortal threats, or severe injuries. Key symptoms include persistent avoidance of trauma-related situations and involuntary flashbacks. PTSD is a recent concept emerging in the 1970s from U.S.-Vietnam War veterans, anti-war groups who felt deceived and betrayed by the military and society. Within just 20 to 30 years, PTSD became Westerners' default framework for processing natural disasters, terrorism, and wars. After the Indian Ocean tsunami, Western mental health practitioners immediately warned that millions would suffer from PTSD. A Reuters report indicated that 15 to 20% of survivors would develop PTSD, and without professional counseling, 16% of these patients would commit suicide. A Duke University professor told reporters that based on past experience, 50 to 90% of survivors would experience PTSD and depression.
Without treatment, these symptoms could persist long term.
Despite differing estimates, experts unanimously agreed survivors needed immediate assistance. The longer the wait, the deeper the trauma becomes. Local mental health resources were woefully inadequate for such massive demand, leading to continuous influx of psychological aid teams and trauma specialists. Researchers arrived in Sri Lanka bringing Western symptom checklists and treatments, but cultural incompatibility soon emerged. First was the language barrier. Post-tsunami translator shortages meant many therapists communicated through locals with broken English. For instance, tourist industry drivers were clearly inadequate for psychotherapy. A classic PTSD diagnostic question asks, "Do you have intrusive memories?" How do you explain intrusive memories to inadequate translators? Then have them accurately translated into Sinhala or Tamil? After painstaking explanations, survivors might feel compelled to report intrusive memories. Such diagnoses could then be inaccurate. Secondly, Sri Lankan survivors' reactions defied Western mental health providers' expectations. One trauma therapist told the BBC, children preferred returning to school over discussing tsunami experiences. Thousands wanted to leave refugee camps days after the tsunami to return home or stay with relatives. By Western standards, this was denial. Only breaking silence and recounting trauma supposedly aided mental health. Westerners viewed these principles as universally applicable. And because humans' instinctive reactions to trauma, like adrenaline-fueled fear triggering fight or flight, are fundamental and universal, so treatments should be universal too. Yet, while aid groups providing basic necessities actively determine whether survivors need tents, food, or medicine, psychological aid groups rarely ask locals what they actually need, nor do they learn about local culture, religion, or traditions. However, Dr. Yairit Fernando, associate psychology professor at Cal State, argues that ignoring local traditions and separating psychotherapy from cultural religious contexts to apply a universal method is incomprehensible. Fernando, a native Sri Lankan who immigrated to the U.S. at 21, studies the psychological impacts of Sri Lanka's prolonged civil war. War deeply affected people psychologically. Westerners assume Sri Lankans, scarred by civil war and poverty, would be fragile and PTSD-prone post-tsunami. But Fernando found remarkable resilience rooted in cultural coping traditions. For instance, religious faith is a vital cornerstone for many Sri Lankans. 74.9% Sinhalese practice Buddhism, 15% Tamil Hindus, Moors are Muslim, and the remainder Christian. Fernando discovered Buddhist or Hindu children exposed to war violence developed less depression than Christian-raised peers. This may stem from protective beliefs like accepting suffering and believing in rebirth or reincarnation. These beliefs stabilize children's psyches post-trauma. University of Colombo professors noted, trauma responses aren't automatic. Victims derive meaning from socio-cultural contexts. This helps them process traumatic events. Without deep cultural insight, therapists may undermine local healing and misinterpret trauma responses. Fernando's further research on tsunami survivors confirmed that Sri Lankans experience trauma significantly differently than Americans. First, unlike Westerners who separate mind and body, Sri Lankans reported more physical symptoms like joint or muscle pain, as if their bodies took direct impact. Secondly, the tsunami's damage manifested not psychologically but socially for Sri Lankans. They rarely reported internal trauma reactions like anxiety, fear, numbness, or other emotions. Instead, they emphasized how the tsunami damaged relationships, disrupting social networks or family roles, causing profound suffering. So, while trauma affecting relationships is common in Western PTSD too, Westerners view it as trauma causing anxiety or depression first, These psychological symptoms then impair social functioning, like being unable to lead a family, meaning impaired social function is an outcome. But for Sri Lankans, impaired social function isn't the outcome, it's the primary symptom of distress. Ignoring this cultural difference and rigidly applying Western methods could backfire. Westerners treat anxiety, depression, and hypervigilance as core PTSD symptoms. So their treatment model often involves taking sick leave to retreat from stress and focus on healing. But for Sri Lankans whose primary symptoms are social, forcing sick leave and private counseling, especially one-on-one with strangers, might worsen their condition. Hong Kong anorexia expert Dr. Lee Chang shares similar concerns. He believes uniform diagnostic standards might obscure local patients' realities and pressures. Dr. Lee had an anorexia patient named Ling who, like Ah Zhao, didn't fit Western diagnostic criteria. Though Ling weighed only 31.5 kilograms, far below the standard 45.5 kilograms. From Ling's perspective, his anorexia had nothing to do with food or body image. He simply found life meaningless and still doesn't know why. When reading about anorexia in the newspaper and seeing other patients intentionally dieting to lose weight, he thought it was strange and frightening, and he felt he definitely didn't have this illness. This made Dr. Lee ask a question. Is it meaningful to classify patients like Ling under a unified diagnostic standard for treatment? Some scholars worry that this practice of implanting Western psychotherapy concepts could weaken local culture. Two scholars from East Timor visited areas around the capital city, Dili. This region has also been ravaged by war. They found that desperate locals no longer acted according to their own culture, but instead followed scientifically based Western methods. They would also pretend to cooperate, accepting foreign methods, in order to obtain foreign funding or food aid. The two scholars observed that implanting Western psychotherapy concepts conveys a message that local ideas and practices are backward, making locals feel weak and incompetent, doubting their ability to build a better future for their homeland. Moreover, this situation isn't limited to Sri Lanka and East Timor. In Rwanda, after the genocide, in Venezuela following severe landslides and floods, and in Japan after the Great Hanshin earthquake, there has been an influx of PTSD concepts. The underlying logic is that people in other parts of the world don't pay enough attention to mental health and have no idea how such events affect the human psyche. They all lack the knowledge Americans have in this field. In response, Arthur Kleinman, a medical anthropologist at Harvard University, pointed out that most disasters in the world occur outside the Western world. We go over and say, "You don't know how to handle such situations." We snatch away their cultural narratives and force ours onto them. This is essentially an egregious example of insulting their humanity. That summarizes the main content of the book. The author examines the global spread of Western mental illness concepts with a unique perspective, how it affects patients and the illnesses themselves, ultimately making the world's madness look increasingly similar. The book's respect for cultural diversity and reflection on Western therapeutic methods have earned it acclaim. However, criticism also exists. A psychology professional wrote that when describing how people in the third world view mental illness, the author usually writes from a generous, positive perspective, while Western methods often come across as negative. But we shouldn't forget that many Western mental health workers approach patients outside the West with more sober and steady attitudes. Additionally, the book ignores that in most developing countries, access to professional psychotherapy is limited, leaving many patients without essential care. The author laments how Western therapeutic culture weakens indigenous healing methods in other cultures. But he fails to mention many local treatments are cruel and inhumane.
If the book's arguments are accepted uncritically, this situation could worsen.
Perhaps Dr. Li Cheng's approach to Hong Kong anorexia patients offers fresh perspective. He notes there's no magic cure for mental illnesses like anorexia. The only meaningful part of treatment is understanding the patient's life and creating motivation for change. If mental health workers avoid blindly accepting Western assumptions, they might hear each patient's true voice. What do you think about this issue? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. That concludes our interpretation of Like Us Crazy. Find show notes below the audio. See you next time.